I'm going to reminisce with you and tell you things that you didn't know that happened in the 7 years that we shot over 150 Dukes of Hazzard episodes.
The tires screamed, the dirt flew, and that famous wheezing laugh echoed, "Goo-goo-goo." To the world, James Best was Rosco P. Coltrane, the bumbling sheriff of Hazzard County. But in 1979, the lawman did the unthinkable. He walked out. It wasn't about fame or a massive salary hike. He quit because of a puddle of mud and a missing chair. This is the story of a Hollywood rebellion. Why did the sheriff turn in his badge? Let's first get to understand the man who wore it. The pedigree, a Shakespearean in Hazzard County. To the casual observer flipping through channels in 1980, James Best looked like a man who had spent his entire life falling off haystacks and talking to dogs. He played Rosco P. Coltrane with a rubber-faced, hyperactive energy that suggested a background in vaudeville or perhaps a lifetime spent in the circus. But the reality of James Best was far more sophisticated and, frankly, far more intimidating. When he parked the patrol car and wiped the Georgia red clay from his brow, he wasn't a dipstick, he was one of the most respected technical actors in the industry. Born Jewel Franklin Guy in 1926, Best's early life was a Southern Gothic novel in the making. Orphaned at 3 in Kentucky and adopted by a family in Indiana, he grew up with a chip on his shoulder and a restless spirit. He didn't find his calling in a comedy club. He found it in the belly of a B-17 bomber during World War II. Serving as a gunner and radio man, Best faced the kind of life-and-death stakes that make a Hollywood tough guy look like a child in a sandbox. When the war ended, he didn't head home to work a quiet trade. He stayed in Germany and joined the Army theatrical troupe. It was there, amidst the rubble of post-war Europe, that the man who would be Rosco discovered he had a genius for the method. By the time he arrived in Hollywood, Best was a powerhouse. We aren't talking about a man who lucked into a sitcom role. James Best was a veteran of the golden age of westerns and noir. He shared the screen with giants like James Stewart in The Naked Spur and Humphrey Bogart in The Caine Mutiny. He was a frequent guest on The Twilight Zone, often playing characters with a dark, brooding intensity that would shock a Dukes of Hazzard fan. He was a chameleon, a man who could play a cold-blooded killer or a tragic hero with equal ease. But his most impressive, serious credential wasn't just his own acting, it was his ability to teach it. James Best ran one of the most prestigious acting schools in California. This is the man who helped shape the craft of legends. He was a mentor to Quentin Tarantino, who would later praise Best's deep understanding of cinematic movement. He coached Burt Reynolds, Clint Eastwood, and Farrah Fawcett. When actors wanted to know how to own a scene without saying a word, they went to James Best. So, how does a man who teaches Shakespeare and the method end up playing a sheriff who gets outsmarted by a basset hound? The answer lies in Best's own creative restlessness. When he was cast as Rosco P. Coltrane for the 1979 pilot of The Dukes of Hazzard, the character was written as a mean, crooked, and rather boring local lawman. In the first few episodes, Rosco is actually quite grounded and quite forgettable. But Best, ever the intellectual, realized that a mean sheriff wouldn't last 3 seasons. He knew that if the audience hated the antagonist too much, the show would lose its lighthearted Robin Hood appeal. Using his vast knowledge of character archetypes, Best decided to cartoonize the law. He reached back into his childhood and pulled out the voice of a bumbling kid playing cops and robbers. He invented the goo-goo-goo laugh as a way to signal to the audience that Rosco wasn't truly evil. He was just a big kid playing a game he could never win. He added the scuffing of the feet and the kickisy sounds to fill the dead air. He transformed a two-dimensional villain into a three-dimensional comedic icon. However, this transformation created a psychological friction. On one hand, Best loved the creative freedom the producers gave him to ad-lib. On the other hand, the serious actor in him was constantly at odds with the production's lack of professionalism. He was a man who respected the craft, a man who came from the era of big-budget studio discipline. He expected a set to run like a Swiss watch, especially a show that was pulling in 30 million viewers a week. Instead, he found himself on a set that treated the human actors as secondary to the stunt cars. He saw the Duke boys, John Schneider and Tom Wopat, being treated like replaceable heartthrobs rather than collaborators. He saw a production office that was getting rich off lunchboxes and toy cars, while the veteran actors were expected to change their clothes in the back of trailers that leaked in the rain. The intellectual gap was widening. Best was a man who spent his weekends painting fine art and writing poetry. Yet his Monday through Friday involved being doused in swamp water for the amusement of the masses. He didn't mind the comedy. He was proud of the joy he brought to children, but he minded the disrespect. He began to feel like a Shakespearean actor, trapped in a demolition derby. The studio bosses at Warner Brothers saw a man who was lucky to have a hit show in his 50s. James Best saw a man who had earned his stripes 10 times over and was now being asked to work in conditions he wouldn't have accepted as a rookie in 1950. The collision between his high-level pedigree and the low-level set conditions was inevitable. It wasn't a matter of if the lawman would break, it was a matter of when. Hazzard County was a gold mine for the network, but for the cast, the working conditions were pure lead. The muddy ultimatum, the 1979 walkout. In the humid, high-stakes world of 70s television production, there was a prevailing philosophy among studio executives. The property was king, and the talent was just a tenant. For the Dukes of Hazzard, the property was a bright orange car and the concept of a back-road chase. The humans inside the cars were viewed as interchangeable parts. But James Best wasn't a part. He was the engine of the show's comedy, and he was about to prove that even a well-oiled machine grinds to a halt when you treat the operator like dirt. The tension didn't start with a bang, it started with a soak. Filming the Dukes of Hazzard was a grueling physical endeavor. It wasn't just about lines of dialogue. It was about the dust of the Santa Clarita Ranch and the swampy humidity of the early Georgia locations. As Rosco, Best was constantly subjected to physical indignities. He was thrown into lakes, covered in soot from blown engines, and, most frequently, drenched in the thick, stagnant mud of Hazzard County's ditches. The year was 1979, and the show was a burgeoning phenomenon. Ratings were skyrocketing, and the merchandising machine was beginning to churn out millions in revenue. Yet, on the front lines, James Best was being told to play in the mud without a place to wash it off. The specific incident that triggered the most famous walkout in Hazzard history was remarkably simple. Best was required to perform a stunt that involved him being thoroughly doused in muck. After the director yelled "cut," Best headed toward what he assumed would be a basic facility to clean up, a shower, or at the very least, a private plumbed dressing room. Instead, he was met with the reality of a budget-conscious production. There were no proper facilities. He was told essentially to wait or to use a cold hose behind a trailer. For a man who had shared dressing rooms with legends at MGM and Warner Brothers during the studio system's peak, this wasn't just a physical discomfort, it was a professional insult. He looked at the executives who were getting wealthy off his goo-goo-goo laugh and realized they didn't care if he spent the next 12 hours in wet, rotting clothes. Best didn't scream or throw a Hollywood tantrum. He simply processed the situation with the cold logic of a military man. He had made a request for a simple, clean dressing room with a working shower, a honey wagon that met basic standards of human decency. The studio's response was a bureaucratic shrug. They believed Best needed them more than they needed him. After all, who was James Best without Rosco? They were about to find out. Best looked at the production staff, turned on his heel, and walked off the set. He didn't just go to his trailer. He went home. The muddy ultimatum was officially in play. Best's demand was clear. He would not return to Hazzard County until he was provided with a dressing room that had a shower and a place to sit that wasn't a folding chair in the dirt. To the suits in the air-conditioned offices of Burbank, this looked like star behavior. To Best, it was a labor dispute. He was 53 years old, a veteran of the industry, and he was done being treated like a stuntman who didn't know any better. Warner Brothers called his bluff. Or they thought they did. They assumed that once the reality of a stopped paycheck hit, the sheriff would come crawling back to his badge. They didn't account for the fact that James Best was a man of immense principle who had plenty of other ways to make a living. He had his acting school, his painting, and a lifetime of savings from a prolific career. He didn't need Hazzard. Hazzard needed him. The standoff became a Cold War. The studio sent out casting calls for substitute lawmen, hoping to prove that the show's formula was the star, not the actors. They brought in a rotating door of guest stars to fill the void left by the sheriff. Meanwhile, Best remained at home, painting and teaching, refusing to answer the phone unless the caller was prepared to discuss plumbing and respect. It was a visceral public demonstration of the serious actor, refusing to be a studio doormat. The mud on his uniform had dried, but his resolve had only hardened. While the executives scrambled to rewrite scripts to explain Roscoe's sudden absence, claiming he was away at a law enforcement convention, the fans began to notice the silence. The show was missing its soul, and the puddle of mud was growing into a sinkhole that threatened to swallow the entire production. Best's walkout was a landmark moment for character actors. He wasn't fighting for $1 million per episode raise. He was fighting for a chair and a shower. He was fighting for the right to be treated as a professional rather than a prop. By walking away, he exposed the dirty truth of television production, that the people who bring the magic to life are often the ones treated with the least amount of care. When the sheriff walked, the studio didn't apologize. They went shopping for a replacement. The Great Sheriff Drought and the Fan Revolt. When James Best turned his back on the Hazzard County line, the executives at Warner Brothers didn't panic. At least not at first. In the boardroom, the philosophy was cold and calculated. The show was about a car, 2 handsome cousins, and a girl in short shorts. They figured the guy in the tan uniform was just flavor text. They believed that as long as there was a badge and a siren, the audience wouldn't care who was behind the wheel. It was a corporate miscalculation of epic proportions. The studio's strategy was to bridge the gap with a rotating door of substitute sheriffs. They introduced characters like Sheriff Grady Bird, played by the capable Dick Sargent of Bewitched fame, and Sheriff Buster Rogers, played by James Hampton. On paper, these were seasoned actors with solid comedic timing. They were professionals who hit their marks and didn't complain about the lack of a shower. But as soon as the cameras rolled, the problem became glaringly obvious. The set felt hollow. The Great Sheriff Drought of Season 2 began, and the atmosphere on screen shifted from organic chaos to forced slapstick. The substitute sheriffs tried to mimic the energy, but they lacked the specific lightning-in-a-bottle madness that Best had spent months perfecting. They were playing sheriff, whereas Best was playing a man who had completely lost his mind to the pursuit of a Dodge Charger. The nuance was gone. The Goo-goo-goo wasn't something you could just teach a guest star. It was a manifestation of Best's own eccentricities. More importantly, the departure of Rosco destroyed the show's most vital comedic engine, the relationship with Boss Hogg. Sorrell Book and James Best had developed a shorthand that bordered on telepathic. Without Best to bounce off of, Book looked lost. The scenes in the back of the Cadillac, once the highlight of every episode, now felt like a monologue. Boss Hogg had no one to bully who could react with the right mix of sycophancy and stupidity. The little fat buddy dynamic was dead, and with it, the show's heart. The audience's reaction was swift and merciless. This was 1979, an era before social media, but the Dukes fans were a vocal tribe. The mailrooms at Warner Brothers were soon flooded with letters that didn't ask about Bo or Luke, they asked where their sheriff was. Kids across America weren't buying the replacements. The rating numbers, which had been on a vertical climb, suddenly leveled off and began a terrifying dip. For the first time, the Dukes machine looked vulnerable. The drought proved a fundamental truth about television. You can't replace chemistry with a script. The fans didn't just want a crooked cop. They wanted that crooked cop. They missed the way Rosco talked to his dog, Flash. They missed the way he'd scuff his heels when he was excited. They missed the weird, high-pitched titty sounds he made when a plan came together. The substitute sheriffs were just actors in costumes. James Best was Hazzard County's favorite disaster. Inside the studio, the tone changed from arrogance to desperation. The executives realized they weren't just losing an actor, they were losing the viewer's trust. Every week that Rosco stayed in his law enforcement convention, the show's flimsy excuse for his absence, the brand lost value. The toy sales, the real bread and butter of the franchise, depended on the kids wanting to play Rosco and Flash. But nobody wanted a Sheriff Grady action figure. Best, meanwhile, was watching the chaos from the sidelines with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew his worth. He wasn't being malicious. He was simply proving his point. He continued to paint. He continued to teach his students the method. And he waited for the phone to ring. He knew that in Hollywood, ratings are the only currency that matters. When the numbers crashed, the studio's principled stance against providing a shower suddenly seemed very expensive. The fan revolt was the final nail in the coffin for the studio's stubbornness. It wasn't just about the letters, it was about the culture. The Dukes had become a national pastime, and the absence of one of its primary colors made the whole picture look gray. The studio realized that James Best wasn't a cog in the machine. He was the oil that kept the gears from grinding. They had tried to replace the unreplaceable, and the market had spoken with a resounding no. By the middle of the season, the white flags were raised. The studio reached out to Best's representatives with a very different tone than the one they had used months prior. They weren't just asking him to come back. They were asking what it would take to make him stay forever. The lawman had won. He had survived the drought, outlasted the substitutes, and proved that even in a show about a jumping car, the man behind the wheel is what makes people tune in. The studio learned the hard way. You can buy a patrol car, but you can't buy the laugh. The Little Fat Buddy Pact. Best and Sorrell Book. While the studio executives were sweating over the Nielsen ratings, a different kind of alliance was forming on the front lines. To the average viewer, Rosco P. Coltrane and boss J.D. Hogg were a pair of bumbling crooks who couldn't find their own feet in the dark. But behind the cameras, James Best and Sorrell Book were the intellectual heavyweights of the set. two men who shared a secret. They were both far too smart for the show they were making, and they loved every second of it. If James Best was the method master, Sorrel Booke was his academic equal. Booke was a classically trained actor with a mastery of multiple languages and a degree from Yale. He had spent years on the stage and in serious character roles before donning the white suit and the padding that turned him into the gluttonous king of Hazzard. When the two of them were together, the IQ on the set doubled. They didn't see the Dukes of Hazzard as a mindless action show. They saw it as a playground for a very specific, high-level form of comedic improvisation. This was the Little Fat Buddy Pact. Early on, Best and Booke realized that the scripts they were handed were often thin, serving merely as connective tissue between car jumps. To keep themselves from going insane with boredom, and to give the audience something worth watching, they began to ad-lib. It's estimated that nearly 80% of the banter between Rosco and Boss Hogg was created on the fly. They developed a shorthand language of coos, giggles, and insults that felt like a private joke the audience was lucky enough to overhear. When Best walked off the set in 1979, the person most affected wasn't the director or the producers. It was Sorrel Booke. Booke found himself in a creative wasteland. The substitute sheriffs were fine actors, but they weren't playmates. They stuck to the script. They waited for their cues. They didn't know how to dance in the space between the lines. Booke's performance during the Great Sheriff Drought reflects a man who is technically present, but emotionally checked out. He missed his foil. He missed the man who would look at him and let out a goo-goo-goo just to see if he could make Booke break character. It was this bond that fueled Best's leverage during the negotiation. Booke didn't just want Best back for the sake of the show. He advocated for him because he knew the set was a lesser place without Best's standards. The two actors shared a common philosophy. Just because a show is for kids doesn't mean it should be trash. They believed in the quality of the nonsense. If they were going to play fools, they were going to be the best fools in the business, and that required a level of professional respect from the studio that was currently missing. During the hiatus, the two stayed in touch. Booke kept Best informed of the mounting chaos at the studio, and Best made it clear that his fight wasn't just about his own comfort. He was taking a stand for the entire cast. He saw how the Duke boys, John Schneider and Tom Wopat, were being treated as mere pin-ups. He saw the crew working impossible hours in the heat without proper support. Best's demand for a dressing room with a shower and a comfortable place to sit became a symbol for a larger shift in the power dynamic on set. When the studio finally folded and invited Best back, the reunion between Rosco and Boss was more than just a script requirement. It was a victory lap. The first time they filmed together after the walkout, the energy on the set reportedly shifted instantly. The spark was back. The ad-libs returned, sharper and faster than before. They leaned into the Little Fat Buddy nicknames with a new sense of ownership. They had proven that the human element of the show was what sold the lunchboxes, not the fiberglass jumping over a creek. This pact of solidarity set a precedent. A few years later, when Schneider and Wopat had their own legendary contract dispute and walkout, they did so knowing that the show had already blinked once when a lead actor stood his ground. Best had provided the blueprint for the Hazzard Rebellion. He showed them that in the face of a massive corporate machine, the only thing that matters is your willingness to say no and mean it. But for Best and Booke, it was never about the politics. It was about the craft of the chuckle. They remained the best of friends until Booke's death in 1994. Best often spoke of Booke not as a co-star, but as his other half in a comedy team that rivaled Laurel and Hardy. They were two serious men who took the business of being silly very, very seriously. They protected each other from the grind of Hollywood, and in doing so, they created a legendary television brotherhood that survived mud, lawsuits, and the test of time. The standoff finally ended, but the terms of the peace treaty were written in gold. The legacy of the badge. When James Best finally rolled back onto the Warner Brothers lot in 1980, he wasn't just returning to a job, he was returning as a victor. The studio had blinked. Waiting for him was the dressing room he'd fought for, a clean, private space with a functioning shower and a chair that didn't feel like a relic from a scrapyard. But the victory wasn't just about plumbing. It was about the shift in the air. The suits now looked at the man in the tan uniform with a newfound, if slightly begrudging, respect. They realized that the Goo-goo-goo wasn't a cheap trick. It was a trademarked asset they couldn't replicate. The return of Rosco P. Coltrane sparked a creative renaissance for the show. Freed from the bitterness of his working conditions, Best leaned even further into the absurdity of the role. He brought Flash, his own basset hound, into the fold, adding a layer of canine comedy that humanized the sheriff even more. He and Sorrel Book doubled down on their improvised antics, turning the later seasons into a masterclass in physical comedy. The ratings stabilized, the fans cheered, and for a few more years, the Hazzard sun shone bright. But Best was a man who never let the badge define his boundaries. When the Dukes of Hazzard finally crossed the finish line in 1985, he didn't fall into the "where are they now" trap that swallows so many TV stars. He didn't spend his days bitter about being typecast as a bumbling lawman. Instead, he treated the end of the show like a graduation. He moved to Florida, where he founded a production company and returned to his first love, teaching. In his later years, Best became a celebrated painter, capturing the serenity of the southern landscapes he had once spent his days racing through. He wrote a memoir, directed films, and continued to mentor young actors, reminding them that their dignity was never for sale. He remained fiercely loyal to his Duke's family, appearing at fan conventions not as a man clinging to the past, but as a patriarch celebrating a legacy. He understood that while he had fought the studio, he had never been fighting the fans. He loved the people who loved Rosco. The legacy of James Best's Last Stand remains a quiet landmark in Hollywood history. He proved that even in the middle of a massive commercial juggernaut, a single actor could demand to be treated like a human being. He debunked the myth that character actors are disposable. Today, when we see high-profile stars standing their ground for better set conditions or creative control, they are walking a path that James Best cleared through the Georgia brush back in 1979. He passed away in 2015 at the age of 88, but the echo of that wheezing laugh hasn't faded. He left behind a body of work that spanned from the golden age of cinema to the peak of the sitcom era. But his greatest performance wasn't caught on film. It was the moment he stepped out of the mud, took off his badge, and walked away from a $1 million paycheck to prove a point about self-worth. In the end, Rosco P. Coltrane wasn't just a character. He was James Best's masterpiece of rebellion. Standing one's ground. The dirty truth of Hazzard County had nothing to do with the crooked deals of Boss Hogg and everything to do with the reality of the Hollywood machine. James Best didn't refuse to work because he hated the show, the fans, or the iconic orange car. He walked away because he refused to let a multi-billion-dollar corporation treat a veteran artist like a disposable piece of equipment. In an industry that often measures a person's worth by their place on a call sheet, Best demanded a different metric: basic human dignity. His rebellion was a victory for every character actor who had ever been told to change in a drafty hallway or wash off in a cold creek. By holding out for a shower and a chair, he wasn't being a diva. He was being a pioneer. He taught the industry that the magic of a hit show isn't found in the stunts or the special effects, but in the heart and humor of the people the audience invites into their living rooms every week. Today, we remember the jumps and the chases, but the real soul of the show lived in that ridiculous, improvised giggle and the chemistry of two brilliant men in a white Cadillac. James Best eventually got his dressing room, but he gave the rest of us something much more valuable: a reminder that no matter how much people love the character you play, you have to love the person you actually are enough to stand your ground. As the sun sets over the fictional hills of Hazzard, we can still see that patrol car disappearing into a cloud of dust. The lawman finally got the last laugh, and this time, it wasn't scripted. James Best proved that even a bumbling sheriff knows when to stop taking orders and start making a stand. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Hazzard history, be sure to subscribe for more untold stories from the golden age of television.